My name's Andrea Levy, and as Nathan mentioned, I'm going to be facilitating this evening's webinar. I'm actually connected with two of the sponsoring organizations of this event. I'm a longtime coordinating editor and columnist at Canadian Dimension, Canada's oldest left-wing magazine, which is now a very lively and provocative digital publication. And I'm a relatively new member of the editorial board of Black Rose Books, although I've been involved in many parallel projects launched by the founder of that publishing house, Dimitri Rousopoulos, over the decades, from the non-aligned peace movement in the 80s to the now defunct Municipal Green Party Ecology Montreal in the 90s to the Montreal Urban Left more recently. I'm also associated with the degrowth movement in Quebec, as well as with the Quebec-based left journal Les Nouveaux Cahiers du Socialisme. I'm delighted to welcome all our listeners, and like Nathan, I encourage you to send in your questions for our panelists. We'll have lots of time for discussion a little later. So I think everyone listening knows that this month a vote will be held to elect 5 non-permanent members of the UN Security Council, and Canada is campaigning for one of them. In its public relations material, the Trudeau government presents its candidacy with the predictable platitudes about Canada's desire to build a better, more stable, just and peaceful world, and with slogans like "Canada brings the world together." And of course, there's much fanfare around the country's by now seriously deflated image as a historical champion of global peacekeeping. Interestingly, there's been pushback against Canada's bid for a Security Council seat, and it's gained some attention, particularly with a petition signed by many prominent social critics, academics, and activists such as David Suzuki, Noam Chomsky, Pom Palmater, Ellen Gabriel, and also Black Rose Books founder Dimitri Rousopoulos and Canadian Dimension founder Psychonic, among many others, including tonight's 2 speakers. So the petition declares that Canada does not deserve a seat on the Security Council, and it puts forth a number of objections, such as Canada's role as an arms exporter, its rush to follow the United States in undermining the UN-recognized government of Venezuela, its defense of mining firms engaged in exploitive and damaging environmental and labor practices, among other things. One particular point raised in the petition is Canada's stance on Palestine, an issue that's been in the news very recently with criticism over the Trudeau government's silence on Israel's plan to annex a major piece of the West Bank. And that silence has been so glaring that Canadian law professor Michael Link, who is the special rapporteur for the human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, noted that while many countries, organizations, and human rights activists were quick to condemn the annexation plan, Canada has developed, quote, a debilitating case of diplomatic laryngitis on this issue. But it seems that the Trudeau government was finally shamed into speaking out by an open letter published just this week by 58 former Canadian diplomats and politicians, including 2 former Liberal foreign ministers, Lloyd Axworthy and Andre Ouellette, along with John Allen, an ambassador to Israel under Stephen Harper. The letter reminded Trudeau that in response to Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, the UN Security Council has affirmed on 8 occasions since 1967 the principle of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war or force. It went on to urge Trudeau to publicly acknowledge Canada's commitment to multilateralism and the rule of law by issuing a statement that Canada reaffirms its position in support of all relevant UN resolutions. Trudeau responded almost immediately with a statement expressing deep concerns and disagreement with the annexation policy and urging the Israeli coalition government to eschew unilateral measures. One of the signatories to the letter, and I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, Ferry de Kerchkov, Canada's ambassador to Egypt from 2008 to 2011, drew attention to the marked difference between the Trudeau government's non-reaction to Israel's annexation plan and its vigorous response to Russia's annexation of Crimea, which included sanctions. The double standard is striking. Chrystia Freeland, then Minister of Foreign Affairs, denounced the illegal invasion and occupation of Crimea, emphasizing Canada's unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and stating Canada and the international community are ready to impose costs on Russia when it ignores international law and the rules-based international order. So that's something we might look at this evening. Another of the 10 reasons cited in the petition to deny Canada a seat on the Security Council is the Trudeau government's refusal to join 122 countries in signing the 2017 nuclear weapon ban treaty. This has particular resonance for Black Rose Books, whose history reflects a deep commitment to peace and disarmament. As a matter of fact, At the 50th anniversary dinner of Black Rose, the guest speaker was Ray Atchison, one of the winners of the Nobel Prize awarded to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. In 2017, she responded to Canada's refusal to sign on to the treaty banning nuclear weapons in an article where she accused Trudeau of putting Canada on the wrong side of history and siding with a policy that is a relic of the Cold War. So there's no dearth of arguments for denying Canada a seat on the UN Security Council. But of course, this campaign needs to be understood in large part as an educational opportunity to shine a spotlight on all the ugly dimensions of Canadian foreign policy. I don't think anyone cares to argue seriously that Canada is less deserving of a role than the US, China, or Russia, all permanent members of the Security Council, or other contenders for the non-permanent seats such as India. Although Canada's competition, Norway and Ireland, may have a stronger claim. So to hash out all these questions tonight, we have two consummately qualified critical analysts who are also signatories to the petition to deny Canada a seat on the UN Security Council. I'm happy to introduce Yves Engler, who many of you likely know from his extensive work on Canadian foreign policy. He's the author of no less than 11 books, the most recent of which, as Nathan mentioned, published this year by Black Rose, is House of Mirrors, Justin Trudeau's Foreign Policy. And this one comes close on the heels of his 2019 book, Left, Right, Marching to the Beat of Imperial Canada, also published with Black Rose. 11 books is a remarkable achievement, given that Yves' career as a radical foreign policy critic began only 15 years ago with his co-authored book on Canadian foreign policy in Haiti. He has been unrelenting ever since, revealing the disappointing reality hidden behind the myths of Canada as a champion of peace and justice in the world, and exposing the dishonorable foreign policy decisions of successive Canadian governments from Lester Pearson to Stephen Harper. Now, of course, he has Justin Trudeau very much in his crosshairs. In addition to writing books, Yves is a widely published journalist, and I'm proud to say a columnist with Canadian Dimension, where lately, as media attention was riveted on the pandemic, he drew attention to the Canadian government's decision in April to lift the moratorium on military exports to Saudi Arabia. And as people the world over expressed their solidarity with those in the United States protesting the killing of George Floyd, Yves penned his latest column under the title, Do Black Lives in Haiti Matter to the Canadian Government? Our other distinguished guest is scholar and activist Tamara Lorincz. Currently a PhD candidate in global governance at the Balsillie School for International Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier University, Tamara has a master's degree in international politics and security studies from the University of Bradford, as well as a law degree and MBA, specializing in environmental law and management from Dalhousie University. A member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, as well as the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Tamara also sits on the advisory committee of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space and the International No to NATO Network. Tamara has written and lectured on the role of the military in accelerating climate change, and she's published pointed opinion pieces in the mainstream media on what's wrong with NATO, offering a very long list of reasons why Canada should quit the alliance, not least of which is its role in inciting a new Cold War with Russia. So our distinguished panelists can begin their presentations. We'll have two 12 to 15 minute presentations from each of them, beginning with Yves, and then we can turn to a discussion and questions from our listeners. So take it away, Yves.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks everyone for out there, and thanks to all the organizers for putting this on, notably Black Rose. So basically, I'm going to lay out some reasons for why Canada doesn't deserve a seat on the Security Council. First, I think a little bit of history. People probably are familiar that in 2010, Stephen Harper's government failed to win a seat on the Security Council. And the important point of my latest book, House of Mirrors, Justin Trudeau's Foreign Policy, is that there's a lot more that's similar in Justin Trudeau's foreign policy to Stephen Harper's foreign policy than is dissimilar. So it's much more of a continuation than any sort of change. One historical point, and so that in and of itself is sort of the reason for why Canada doesn't deserve a seat in the Security Council today, because it's a continuation of policies that were rejected 10 years ago. Going backwards historically, though, sometimes people mention that the 2010's loss of a Security Council seat was the first time ever that Canada had lost a bid. That's actually incorrect. right at the after the founding of the UN, Canada lost its bid for a Security Council seat, in large part because Canada had supported the Big Five veto at the UN, i.e. giving the US, France, Britain, Russia, and China a veto over UN Security Council resolutions, the possibility to veto those. And the smaller and mid-sized countries, this of course was before decolonization, so it was a much smaller UN, those countries rejected Canada's bid right after the creation of the UN because they were angry with Canada's role in supporting the Big Five veto. So Canada, right from the get-go, played a role in this very undemocratic nature of the United Nations, and specifically the functioning of the Security Council. Now, there are, as Andrea's already gone through, there's a whole list of reasons to be against Canada's bid for Security Council seat. A number of them have been laid out in the petition, open letter that people can see at the foreignpolicy.ca website. Just simple things. The Basel-Ban Amendment that blocks rich countries from dumping their trash in poor countries. That became law in September. Canada has not ratified. 97 countries ratified by September, became law. Canada has not ratified. The Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Degrading Treatment and Punishment. Canada has not ratified. Dozens and dozens of International Labour Organization conventions, Canada has not ratified. The Paris Climate Accord in 2015, the Justin Trudeau government shifted a bit in its opposition to climate negotiations and agreed to reductions of Canadian greenhouse gas emissions in 2015, but have basically ignored those targets and are already quite clearly on path to the breaking the targets which were already insufficient targets that Canada had put forward. And in between 2017 and 2018, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions actually increased 15 million tons between 2017 and 2018. And then Trudeau purchased a tar sands pipeline. So the climate question is an important question of Canada's, and that Canada, of course, is one of the world's top per capita carbon emitter. One area that Canada has increasingly become the face of Canadian foreign policy over the past 2 decades is the climate question, or is the mining sector. And Canada has about 0.5% of the world's mining companies, 5.5% of the world's population, half of all mining companies are based or listed on Canadian stock exchanges. So this country is huge global power in the mining sector. Those companies have been responsible for an endless stream of abuses. You can pick almost any country in the global south, and you'll find an example of a Canadian mining company that has led to ecological damage, social conflict, clear human rights violations. And about 6 UN bodies in recent years have called on the Canadian government to better regulate Canadian mining companies abroad. In 2015, the UN Human Rights Committee said, quote, "The state party Canada should enhance the effectiveness of existing mechanisms to ensure that all Canadian corporations under its jurisdiction, in particular mining corporations, respect human rights standards when operating abroad." The Trudeau government promised to bring in an ombudsperson that would have some teeth, some capacity to end public support for Canadian mining companies found to be engaged in abuses abroad. They promised that before the election. After the election, they have brought in an ombudsperson with basically no capacity to even force companies to provide documents, let alone to actually restrict public support for Canadian mining companies. And so this is in the context of Canada's foreign policy, from trade commissioners to Export Development Canada to signing foreign investment promotion protection agreements, all designed to facilitate Canadian mining companies operating abroad. And the Trudeau government has spent, as a continuation of the Harper government, has spent tens of millions, over $100 million in aid to support different projects of the Canadian mining sector abroad. The Trudeau government has even backed up the most controversial Canadian mining company in the country where it was involved in its worst abuses. So in 2017, Barrick Gold was involved in a major conflict with the Tanzanian government over unpaid royalties, over extracting unpaid taxes. Big conflict with one of the top news items in Tanzania. And this was at one of their mines in Tanzania, the North Mara mine, where there's been 65 people killed by Barrick-paid security forces between 2006 and 2016. And the Canadian High Commissioner in Tanzania, Ian Miles, organized a conference between the president of Tanzania and the head of Barrick Gold. After that meeting, Ian Miles said, quote, "Canada is very proud that it expects all its companies to respect the highest standards, fairness, and respect for laws and corporate social responsibility. We know that Barrick is very much committed to those values." So here you have the top Canadian diplomat in Tanzania explicitly saying that Barrick upholds, these high standards of corporate responsibility. And so you have to ask yourself, if Barrick, responsible for dozens of deaths in Tanzania, hundreds of millions of dollars of unpaid taxes, is a company that the Trudeau government is willing to back globally. Basically, there's nothing that a Canadian mining company can do and not expect the Canadian government to have its back. And I have to say, the two countries that Canada is competing with at the Security Council, Ireland and Norway, for the two Western Europe and other group seats, they are not associated. They don't have an industry as controversial as the mining sector that their foreign policy is so closely associated with. Another area of Canadian foreign policy that needs to be interrogated on this question of the Security Council bid is the fact that the Trudeau government has led a brazen campaign to try to overthrow the UN-recognized government of Venezuela. And that campaign has included just hundreds of statements from the Canadian government, pressure on countries all around the world to join the campaign, pressure on countries in the Caribbean where Canada has significant influence, and the Caribbean community, the CARICOM, which has a non-interventionist mandate. Canada trying to pressure the CARICOM to join its campaign against the Venezuelan government. Canada set up with Peru, set up the Lima group of governments opposed to the Nicolas Maduro government in Venezuela. Canada has the Ottawa Declaration of the Lima group back in February of last year basically called on the military to overthrow the Maduro government, to quote, to demonstrate their loyalty to the interim president. And Canada has been at the forefront of defining Juan Guaido, the head of the National Assembly, who before he became the head of the National Assembly in January of last year, was basically a marginal far right-wing politician in Venezuela. Canada has been at the forefront of this whole international campaign to try to recognize Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela. And Canada was involved in that process in weeks and the months before Juan Guaido self-declared himself as president of Venezuela, and a number of Globe and Mail, Canadian press, Associated Press reported on that at the time. And this is a clear and flagrant intervention into Venezuelan affairs. And so just looking at the Canadian campaign in Venezuela, which I should mention also includes 4 rounds of sanctions that Canada's adopted against Venezuela, legitimating the more brutal U.S. sanctions that are responsible for tens of thousands of deaths, and just further destruction of the Venezuelan economy. This campaign that Canada is waging against Venezuela, on the face of it, it violates the UN Charter against intervention. Sanctions are contrary to international law. It also violates the Charter of the Organization of American States. Just on the face of it, this should be rejected. But then, if you broaden the analysis or the scope of discussion, you find that the hypocrisy of the campaign is almost too much. So one of our allies in the Lima group focused on overthrowing Venezuelan government and saying that Juan Guaido is the constitutionally legitimate president of Venezuela, is Honduras. Honduras's president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, defied the Honduran constitution to run for a second term. Then when he was losing the vote, all of a sudden, it was 60% of vote counted. He was down by 5 percentage points. All of a sudden, the voting stopped. And when it started back up, Juan Orlando Hernandez was in the lead and was declared president of Honduras. Clear violation of the Honduran constitution, which only allows one term for presidents. The Canadian government also claims its campaign against Venezuela is about the human rights violations in Venezuela. Well, one of our allies in this campaign is Iván Duque in Colombia, that has a far worse human rights record. He's come out against the peace accord, a very important peace accord that was signed a couple of years ago in Colombia. Over the past year and a half, or in 2019, during Duque's time, nearly 100 former FARC guerrilla members who agreed to the peace accord have been assassinated. More than 100 social activists, indigenous activists have been assassinated. That rate has only increased this year. So it's not, the campaign against Venezuela is not about human rights violations, not about democracy. Another area that makes Canada, or why countries should vote against Canada's bid for Security Council seat. I should also mention that, again, Ireland and Norway have not been part of this campaign against the Venezuelan government in anything close to Canada's level of interference. Another issue that's been touched on, that Andrea touched on earlier, is the question of Palestine. Karen Rodman from Just Peace Advocates did an analysis of Canadian voting record on the question of Palestine at the UN over the past 20 years, and it's remarkable. Since 2000, Canada has voted against 166 resolutions upholding Palestinian rights. Ireland and Norway have not voted against a single one of those resolutions. And that rate of Canada voting against the resolutions has only picked up in the past decade. The Chrétien government was a lot better. Martin got worse. Harper made it worse. And Trudeau's even worse than Stephen Harper. So that in and of itself, just the flagrant violation or isolation of Canada against world opinion on UN resolutions, it should be enough. In just as one extreme example, in December of 2017, 176 countries voted in favor of Palestinian statehood. Canada, US, Israel, and Micronesia and Palau were the only countries that voted against that resolution. So just complete isolation against world opinion at the UN with regards to Palestinian rights. But it goes much beyond that. Earlier this year, Canada's ambassador in Israel, Deborah Lyons, actually organized a party for Canadians fighting in the Israeli military. So Canadians who go and join another country's military, she organized a celebration for them and declared that she was proud of the Canadians fighting in the Israeli military. These, of course, the Israeli military, of course, is involved in an occupation in the West Bank, and many of these Canadians have been directly involved in that occupation. Also, the Israeli military is involved in the brutal siege on Gaza and firing on peaceful demonstrators as part of the March of Return. It goes way beyond that. So in 2016, at the end of 2016, the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling on countries to distinguish between products coming from occupied territory and Israel proper. Yet the Canadian government has a free trade agreement, which the Trudeau government has recently expanded upon, that allows products coming in from illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank to come into Canada duty-free. De facto Canadian recognition of the Israeli occupation. Even more than that, when there was a campaign by an activist in Winnipeg to have Israeli wines produced in illegal settlements in the West Bank, to have them properly labeled as not coming from Israel, the Canadian Food Administration called for proper labeling of these wines. The Trudeau government actually forced the Canadian Food Inspection Agency to reverse course. And then when this Canadian court said, no, of course these wines should be properly labeled, the Trudeau government has appealed that decision and is taking that all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court. So the Canadian government has very aggressively accepted Israel's illegal expanding occupation of the West Bank. And just to finish on Canada's role and non-deserving nature at the Security Council, in November of 2018, Chrystia Freeland, Canada's foreign minister, when she was in Israel, she told Benjamin Netanyahu and an Israeli audience that if Canada won a seat on the Security Council, it would, quote, act as an asset for Israel. So the Canadian government explicitly saying that part of their objective in winning a Security Council seat is to act as an asset of Israel. Clearly, the Canadian government doesn't deserve a seat on the Security Council. And I invite everyone to sign the petition at foreignpolicy.ca and go to Just Peace Advocates website and send letters to UN ambassadors asking them to vote against Canada's bid for a seat on the UN Security Council. Thank you.
I'm not sure if, okay, my mic's not muted. So thank you very much, Yves. That was great. And we'll return, I hope, to some of those points a little later after we hear from Tamara Lorincz. So go ahead, Tamara.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to participate in this important panel. I would like to build on the points that Yves made, and I would like to share some slides. I think that they provide an important context for our discussion. So I'm just going to share that now with you. Can you see my slides?
We can.
Okay, wonderful, great. So 193 member countries of the United Nations General Assembly are going to be determining which of three countries, Canada, Ireland, or Norway, will get 2 non-permanent seats for the council. And they're going to be scrutinizing our foreign policy and our actions in international relations. Now, one of the things that they will be looking at is our foreign policy. And if you compare and contrast Ireland and Norway's position, you'll see that Ireland has a very substantive document that articulates its foreign policy. It came out in 2015. It's called The Global Ireland's Foreign Policy for a Changing World. Norway has 2 very substantive documents. One came out in 2016 entitled Setting the Course for Norwegian Foreign and Security Policy. And in 2018, its most recent statement is Norway's role and interest in multilateral cooperation. Canada, by contrast, does not have a written foreign policy. The Trudeau Liberals denied Canadians an opportunity to consult and craft a foreign policy. Instead, the Canadian government in 2016 announced consultations for a new defense policy. And that policy was finalized and announced in June of 2017. Canada has a very militaristic posture towards the world by virtue of this defense policy. It's called Strong, Secure, and Engaged. And over the next 2 decades, Canada is going to be spending $553 billion on the military to maintain high-end warfighting. This is an extremely belligerent posture, and the international community knows this. What Canada does have is just a speech that that our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, gave in the House of Commons in June of 2017. It's a very short speech, and I would like to read one quote that really exemplifies this very militaristic posture of Canada. She says, and I quote, "To put it plainly, Canadian diplomacy and development sometimes require the backing of hard power. Force is, of course, always a last resort, but the principled use of force, together with our allies and governed by international law, is part of our history and must be part of our future. To have that capacity requires a substantial investment, which this government is committed to making." So you can see that armed force is one of the priorities for Canada's foreign policies. Now, I'd like to show you Canada's investment in our armed forces. This is a graph that I created using the Public Accounts of Canada, and it shows you military spending for the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces over the past 2 decades. 1997, we spent $8 billion on the military, and last year we spent $31 billion on the military. By contrast, the Canadian government spent $500 million in 1997 for the Department of Environment and Climate Change, and last year $1.9 billion on that department, even though climate change is the greatest human security challenge that we're facing. So Canada disproportionately spends much more on armed force instead of climate and environmental security. Now, there is a misperception in Canada that we don't spend enough on the military. Well, this is a chart from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, from their annual report, Trends in World Military Expenditures. And you can see at the arrow that Canada is ranked 14th highest in the world for military spending. And you can see it's $22 billion, that's in US dollars. In Canadian, it's of course about $31 billion, like I showed you in the previous slide. And you can see that the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, the United States, China, Russia, France, and the United Kingdom are in the top 10 countries for military spending. You don't see Ireland or Norway in this chart for military spending. So Canada spends a lot on its armed forces. SIPRI also does a report every year on arms transfers, and you can see that Canada is ranked 16th highest in the world for arms transfers. We're selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, India, the UAE, Israel, and of course the United States. And you can see again that the P5 members are the top for arms exporters. Canada sells more weapons than Norway, and Ireland is not even on this chart. So despite the fact that Canada spends so much money on its military and it's exporting weapons all over the world, it's one of the lowest contributors for peacekeeping. Now, there is also a misperception in Canada that we are a peacekeeping country, but you can see from this chart, this is from the UN Peacekeeping Office, that Canada is currently ranked 77 among countries contributing to peacekeeping. We only have 35 soldiers that are wearing the UN blue helmet. We have a military that's comprised of 61,000 soldiers, and we are contributing so little to UN peacekeeping operations. Norway is ranked higher than us at 65 soldiers to UN peacekeeping operations, and Ireland is much higher at about 475 soldiers that are helping with UN peacekeeping. Now, UN peacekeeping deployments is a really important activity and decision for the UN Security Council, and you can see that Canada is so low in supporting UN peacekeeping operations. Another aspect that's critical to international peace and security is disarmament. In the spring of 2018, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres announced a new agenda for disarmament with goals and timelines, and he encouraged every single member state to have a plan to meet this agenda. Canada has roundly ignored it. Whereas Ireland has disarmament as one of its pillars for its foreign policy, and it's very clear in its document. Nuclear disarmament, abolishing the worst weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, is one of the most important aspects of this new agenda. In 2017, the international community negotiated and finalized a new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Canada snubbed those negotiations, and Canada is refusing to join this important new treaty. Whereas Ireland helped in the negotiations, and Ireland has also assigned and in the process of ratifying this treaty. Now, one of the reasons why Canada isn't participating in this treaty is because of our membership in NATO. NATO is a military alliance that relies on a very dangerous nuclear deterrence. And our membership in NATO is actually seen as a problem for the international community. Because so often NATO circumvents and undermines the actions of the United Nations. And so our membership in this alliance is actually seen as a detriment to Canada. I'd also like to show you Canada's webpage for its UN Security Council bid, and you can see that it's identifying these 5 priorities. But as Yves has just explained, and as I have just shown in these slides, that Canada is really disingenuous in saying that it cares about peace, it cares about climate change, or it cares about multilateralism. You can also hear for yourself Canada's weak positions and its poor performance, actually. Last Friday, the World Federation of United Nations Associations held an online debate for Canada, Norway, and Ireland. It's 2.5 hours. It's available online. You can watch this debate, and you can see our ambassador at the arrow. Our ambassador is pictured there, Marc-André Blanchard. Next to him is Norway's ambassador, Mona Jewel, in the purple jacket, and then Ireland's UN ambassador is Geraldine Bryn Nason, and they are much stronger in that debate. Their positions are much better. Canada is extremely weak. I would also like to show you our website where our petition is that you can sign onto, and you can read more detail about the open letter and some other articles and watch some videos, statements people have made saying why Canada doesn't deserve a seat on the UN Security Council. I'd also like to invite you to sign on to this petition. That's a parliamentary petition calling on the Canadian government to lift its sanctions that it has on many countries around the world. Canada right now has enacted sanctions that are illegal, that do not have authorization of the UN Security Council against Venezuela, against Nicaragua, against Syria, Russia, and other countries. So I urge you to go to this website, find petition E2630, and sign this one as well. And I'd also like to invite you to a national day of action to call on the Canadian government to stop arming Saudi Arabia. You can find the Facebook event, War is Not Essential. It's going to be happening next Thursday, June 11th, and I encourage you to participate. And finally, I'd like to encourage you to mark your calendars for a big anti-war and peace conference that's going to be taking place in Ottawa next June. And there's also going to be a big protest against CANSEC. Canada hosts the largest weapons fair in North America in Ottawa every spring. And we need to use this opportunity to push for a new foreign policy, one that's based on real peace, justice, and environmental security. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamara. That was great, very rousing. And we all have our political work cut out for us in the next few days because you've given us an agenda, which is terrific. So if you could stop sharing your screen now, we can move on.
I am trying to do that.
I see Google Chrome is not responding. Okay, well, there's no rush. Now, I believe we were supposed to be getting some questions coming in from our listeners, but I'm not seeing anything in the chat. So, well, we can start the discussion ourselves. I have a number of questions. I'm seeing NB on the screen now. Nathan, are you trying to join us?
No, I just had to kick out Tamara because her screen was having problems, but she'll be coming back.
Okay. And do you have any questions yet for us? Or shall we just proceed with our own discussion for now?
Go ahead.
Okay.
With your own.
So I'll kick this off. Again, just ripped from the news. There was much ado about nothing in the media the other day when Justin Trudeau paused for a whole 21 seconds when he was asked to react to the news of US citizens who were protesting peacefully near the White House being tear gassed to make way for Donald Trump's photo opportunity. So in your view, Tamara and Yves, what does the Trudeau government's response to the recent events in the United States surrounding the killing of George Floyd by police tell us about the role Canada would be likely to play on the Security Council?
Well, I'll start, I guess. I think that we already know that the historical record shows that Canada's voting record, when it's been on the Security Council, is very closely aligned with the U.S. voting record. So a seat on the Security Council would be basically another American voice on the Security Council. You know, there may be some scenarios where the Trudeau government, if Donald Trump was to win again, would want to try to break, show some difference. But I think it's very important to point out that, like, now, first of all, I just want to say with a 21-second pause, that was of course planned. I've been trying to figure out what the exact public relations objective of that pause was. If it was just to have us discuss the pause, or it was to do with his history of blackface, and if it's so clearly Trudeau's unwillingness to criticize Trump when Trump is talking about, making people have been accusing Donald Trump of being, having fascistic tendencies for quite a while. But what we've seen the last couple of days are the clearest signs of Donald Trump's fascistic tendencies. And Trudeau's unwillingness to criticize Trump on that, I think, speaks volumes to just the extent to which, we saw that when Trump undercut climate accords. We've seen this repeatedly where Trudeau either got, Merkel from Germany wants to criticize U.S. climate policy. Trudeau's the one offside for that. So that it's a pretty stark example of their unwillingness to challenge Trump. But yes, I think in the Security Council, what we would see is that Canada would overwhelmingly echo U.S. policy, maybe try to take on some sort of like high-profile initiative where they would try to throw some kind of liberal gloss on a pet project, but effectively it would be mostly aligning with U.S. policy.
Tamara, would you like to respond to that question as well?
I think that Yves gave a very good, thorough response.
Okay. All right. So now questions are coming in from our listeners, and they're good ones. I'm going to start with an obvious one that none of us has discussed. What is Canada's interest in being on the Security Council? This is coming from, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this correctly, Medani or Medani.
I'm happy to respond to that. How I see it, there's basically two interests. There is a public relations branding interest of Justin Trudeau, and Trudeau immediately upon winning the election announced, we did a whole thing about Canada being back, and we've been 10 years of Canada being gone from the international scene, and tell the world we're back. And so the seat is partly about the fact that Stephen Harper lost the seat in 2010. They have a whole international rules-based order branding element that obviously is aligned with UN. So a very important part of this is branding to contrast with the Conservatives. And so I think that when you see right-wing commentators say this is a vanity project, and that's the main criticism we hear about Canada's bid for Security Council seat, not the substantive component, which is what I think we were trying to bring tonight, and what the open letter is trying to bring, substantive component of problems with Canadian foreign policy. I think there's a significant element of truth to the right-wing criticism to say this is a branding or vanity project, or I would frame it more as branding. The second part I think that is going on here is just the logic of the Canadian state and global affairs. Global affairs wants more power. The logic of the bureaucracy like that is to expand its power. Being on the Security Council gives Canada more power in global affairs. And I think that this is an element of Canadian foreign policy that just more generally, I mean, just even at the level of like the individual within the bureaucracy, if you are a ambassador or the head of a country desk at Global Affairs Canada, if Canada is a more powerful country, that is good for you when you interact with let's say a Haitian official. If you have more power, they tend to be more deferential to you, and that feels good as a diplomat. So it trickles all the way down to that level. And as I see it, the two main forces driving Canadian foreign policy historically: support for empire, historically British, today American empire, and support for Canadian corporate interests. That is overwhelmingly what drives Canadian foreign policy, despite all the rhetoric. Both of those forces, I don't see any indication that those forces are in any way against Canada's bid for Security Council seat, and in fact, probably generally supportive. So from the standpoint of the bureaucracy, why not pursue this bid for Security Council seat? So again, there's a logic of expanding Canadian state power, and there's a particular partisan branding element for the Liberals and Justin Trudeau. And I also want to go one step further with that, is that Trudeau has been lobbying absolutely ferociously in recent weeks for this Security Council seat. Just before the pandemic, he of course went to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia to the African Union Summit to basically make the case for Canada. He was supposed to go to the CARICOM Summit, the Caribbean Community Summit, just after that. The Wet'suwet'en struggle blocked that from happening, and the Foreign Affairs Minister went. But in recent weeks, in the last month or so, he has been in dozens and dozens of heads of states. He's had phone calls. He's had phone calls with the UN ambassador groupings of the Caribbean community, African countries, Asia Pacific, Arab states. And this is the Prime Minister of Canada speaking to the UN ambassador of, Uganda or whatever African country. That is viewed as a big step down. Usually heads of state deal with other heads of state, or they deal with, maybe the foreign minister. That's even considered a step down. But in this case, he's literally calling the ambassadors in New York. And so they know that losing this is also a lot on the line for Justin Trudeau in his branding exercise as well. And not to go too long on this, it's unbelievable that the NDP, when you compare and contrast the Irish and Norwegian record versus the Canadian record in international affairs, the NDP and the Greens have completely ignored any criticism of Canadian foreign policy in the context of the Security Council bid. They've stayed completely mum. They've joined Team Canada. Now, if Trudeau loses, the NDP and the Greens are going to have a major partisan self-interest in criticizing Trudeau's foreign policy, its anti-Palestinian positions, its refusal to engage in nuclear disarmament, et cetera, for having contributed to Canada's loss of a Security Council seat. And I wonder if Trudeau loses, if they are going to take those partisan shots, or are they going to, even when it's clearly in their self-interest, or they're going to stick to their Team Canada vision of we're just a rah, Canada's bid for Security Council, and we can't criticize that, which I think says a lot about the nature of Canadian political culture. Sorry, that was long.
No, that's fine. That was great. It was very concise and interesting. How about you, Tamara? Do you want to make any additional comments about why Canada is vying for a seat on the Security Council?
Well, I would just like to add to what Yves said, that it's widely recognized that the UN Security Council is the most powerful and prestigious international body. So it's definitely one of the reasons for sure is reputation that Canada wants to get on the seat. It also will be an opportunity for Canada to echo and to buttress American foreign policy. And so this is what is really problematic. In the debate that was held last week, Ireland and Norway made the point that they have much more independent positions than Canada. Canada is very much seen as supporting U.S. positions. So if we get a seat on the UN Security Council, it will be the world will see it as America Light, Canada as America Light. The other thing is that Norway and Ireland have held a UN Security Council seat most recently. So they both served on the Security Council from 2001 to 2000 or 2000 to 2002. Canada last held a seat in 2000. So it's been longer for us to have a position on the Security Council. But I'd like to also mention that one of the reasons why Canada lost the election in 2010 was because the African countries voted against Canada because of our low financial contribution to overseas development assistance. Canada still has very low ODA. That has not improved since the Harper government. So currently, Canada spends about between $4 and $5 billion on overseas development assistance, which is equivalent to about 0.28% of gross national income, whereas on a GNI percentage and a per capita percentage, Norway and Ireland spend much more on overseas development assistance, and the African countries know this. The African countries are also very angry at Canada for leading the NATO bombing of Libya, which totally destabilized North Africa and led to the humanitarian and refugee crisis there. So I don't expect that the African countries, despite the recent efforts that Justin Trudeau and our foreign affairs minister have made recently, in terms of having multilateral and bilateral relationships with various African states, I don't think that they'll support Canada in this bid because of these reasons.
Okay, thanks. Okay, a couple more questions coming in here. And I think, Tamara, this should interest you. How does Canada's role in NATO affect its foreign policy?
Well, Canada and Norway are founding members of NATO. Ireland is not a member of the military alliance. The international community, is well aware of this. This is a point that was raised at the debate last week. The international community is not going to want two members on the Security Council for the Western European and other group that are NATO members. So our membership in this alliance is actually detrimental to us. If you look at the Cold War record of Canada's participation in NATO missions and interventions, for instance, the 1999 bombing of Serbia, this was illegal. This was not authorized by the UN Security Council. Canada's NATO mission in Afghanistan is a complete failure. Canada's bombing of Libya, Canada led the NATO bombing of Libya in 2011. I mean, it totally destabilized the and has caused a continuous crisis. So NATO is very much seen as a body that, like I said, undermines the United Nations. It violates international law. It violates the UN Charter. And so if you look at our record in NATO, since the end of the Cold War, it has really been, very, very problematic. And the international community knows this, and they're not going to want another NATO member on the Security Council.
Yves, did you want to add anything?
Well, I mean, NATO is, of course, a central part of Canadian foreign policy. NATO is what drives Canadian military policy, and it's all despite all the rhetoric of peacekeeping, even at the height of peacekeeping, as Jack Granatstein, a very prominent military historian, has pointed out, 90% of Canadian Canadian military policy was oriented around NATO. Today, you have Canadian troops on the border of Russia, 540 Canadian troops in Latvia, despite the pandemic, as part of Canada leading one of 4 NATO missions in Eastern Europe. You have Canadian troops in Iraq as part of NATO mission there. Canadian naval vessels patrolling different parts of the world as part of NATO missions. So NATO is a belligerent body. If you go back to its founding, Canada was one of 3 countries that began the process of creating it: Britain, the US, and Canada, before its creation in 1949. And it's always been about, at that time it was about defending Western Europe from socialist revolution, internal revolution. Should I say defending the Western European elite against internal socialist revolution, and bringing the former European colonial colonies under a emerging U.S. Geopolitical U.S. empire, if you like. So NATO is clearly a kind of, it's a belligerent force, and it's a very important part of, and again, Justin Trudeau, if you read his 2017 Liberal government's defense policy statement, they repeatedly praise NATO. Trudeau himself praises NATO over and over again. So there's no doubt that NATO is very much central to Canadian foreign policy.
Okay, thanks Tamara, thanks Yves for those responses, and thanks Henry for that very good question. Another question that I think arose from your early remarks, Yves, about the NDP and the Green Party and their cheerleading for Canada's bid for a seat on the Security Council. We got a question from Tyler asking which party has the best foreign policy and why. I don't know if either of you would like to take a stab at that one.
No party has the best. Well, the Communist Party would have the best foreign policy. Of the parties in the House of Commons, there is massive concessions to imperialistic Canadian foreign policy. That's what my last book, Left, Right, Marching to Defeat Imperial Canada, is largely about. I can just a sort of anecdote, one of the staffers for one of the most left-wing MPs in the House of Commons was asked to sign a petition from somebody they actually been working with about this UN Security Council seat. And they responded by saying, we can't sign this because it will be seen that we will be offside with Team Canada. The person actually used the word Team Canada and then, sort of explained that this would just be too marginalizing for the MP to endorse. So I think that's a bit of the situation. If you take a look at defense policy or military policy and the 2017 Liberal military policy statement, the NDP's military critic at the time criticized the fact that the Liberals had announced 70% increase in military spending over a decade, and that money wasn't coming quick enough. It was too much down the road. If you take a look at NDP policy on Venezuela, Hélène Lavadière, who was the former foreign affairs critic of the NDP until the most recent election, she had been criticizing way back in 2013. She'd been criticizing Harper for not being hard enough on Hugo Chavez, and the NDP, Hélène Lavadière, recognized Juan Guaido not immediately, but like 2 weeks later. She followed Europe, which had this policy of if the Venezuelan government doesn't organize new elections by the end of the month, then we are going to recognize Juan Guaido. That was what the NDP ended up following as their policy. So the concessions to the dominant order from the left end of in 2011, it was a unanimous vote in the House of Commons for the bombing of Libya. Well, I should be clear about that. Elizabeth May wasn't there for one of the votes, and she was the only vote against in one of the House of Commons votes. But as I've written about Elizabeth May, I've written stories about Elizabeth May and her role with supporting aggressive policies towards Iran, refusal to criticize spending $60 billion on naval vessels. Tamara can go into that more. She has more background on some of the policy, some of the party's policies on military spending. So yeah, the reality is that we live in a political culture where in my opinion, I haven't assessed this thoroughly for every country in the world, but my opinion is that Canadians, we know that Canadians self-appraisal about their country's role in the world is the highest of any country in the world. Studies have shown it's as high as 94% of Canadians think their country is a force for good in the world. We have a political culture where, in my opinion, the gap between reality of Canadian foreign policy and public perception is as big or bigger than any other country in the world. There are very few political forces in this country willing to point out that Canada has very close ties with the two main empires of the past 200 years, British, Canadian, and its foreign policy was oriented around that, and it's about advancing Canadian corporate interests. The different parties are, better. I would say the Liberals are a bit better than the Conservatives. The NDP is a little bit better than NDP and the Greens are a little bit better than the Liberals, but the whole thrust of the political culture is very much supportive of Canadian imperialism.
Thank you. Tamara, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I would. The Harper Conservatives released a defense policy in 2008 called the Canada First Defense Strategy. And if you compare that 2008 defense strategy with the Liberals' 2017 defense policy, Strong, Secure, and Engaged, in many ways, the Liberal defense policy is much worse than the Conservatives. We are going to be building more warships. We're going to be buying more fighter jets. We're going to be buying armed drones, maintaining high-end warfighting, recruiting more soldiers. And NATO is very much a cornerstone for our defense policy. None of the political parties denounced, the Greens or the NDP denounced the new defense policy. Randall Garrison, who was the NDP defense critic, as Yves explained, said that the increase to military spending wasn't high enough. The Green Party, Elizabeth May, was was quiet. She didn't say anything about it, but silence is acquiescence. And if you look at the party's election platforms in this last federal election, and you can compare and contrast them on their foreign policy positions, you can see that there's very little difference, actually. All of the parties, the Conservatives, the Liberals, the NDP, the Greens, they all called for an increase to military spending. They said that they took pride in our armed forces. But as Yves just explained, you know, the Canadian military is doing around the world is so destructive. It's so destabilizing. You know, to think that right now Canada is leading a battle group in Latvia and provoking Russia, it's reprehensible that Canada, you know, bombed Libya and has destabilized one of the wealthiest countries on the African continent. And right now, Canada is leading a NATO mission in Iraq to train the Iraqi forces, but the Iraqi people have been very clear on major protests calling for all foreign forces to get out of their country, but Canada is refusing to listen to the people and to get out. And it's not just the Iraqi people, the Iraqi government as well. Passed a resolution in January saying that they wanted all foreign forces out, but Canada is twisting Iraq's arm with NATO to say that we want to stay because we want to keep a NATO foothold in the Middle East, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan. And this is to very much counter Iran, and you know, we're partnering with Israel on all of this. So none of the political parties in this country have the courage to criticize Canadian international relations, to criticize Canadian armed forces and all of our military operations around the world. And that needs to change, but it's going to require us to push the political parties in the right direction.
Okay. We have about 10 more minutes now. So we've got a couple of questions. One from Ken about Canada's role in Syria, Nicaragua, Haiti, and Libya. Well, we've covered Libya a little bit. I don't know, Yves, if you'd like to perhaps make a few comments about Haiti in light of your recent column too. That might be worth mentioning.
Yeah, I mean, Justin Trudeau just had a call with Jovenel Moïse, the president of Haiti, a few days ago. And this is really just the continuation of Canada's, this is 20 years of basically terrorizing the Haitian people. I mean, Canada has just explicitly undercut democracy and Haitian sovereignty. And Jovenel Moïse, as many might not know, had faced the largest protests. So, last year, sort of this year, there were, protests, some of the biggest, protests all around the world. Far and away, the largest and the most sustained protests were taking place in Haiti. They got the least amount of coverage for a whole series of reasons, in part because they were the most explicitly anti-imperialist popular revolt taking place on the globe. And Moïse is highly corrupt, is highly repressive. It's the electoral legitimacy is paper thin. Very few people voted. Corruption in the balloting, etc. And Haitians made it abundantly clear over more than a year. There was like 5 general strikes. The biggest one in October of last year. They made it abundantly clear, and one of the general strikes lasted for almost like a month, that they wanted Moïse to go. The only reason Moïse is in office is because he had the backing of Washington and Ottawa. And Haitians know this by the millions. There are example after example of Haitians throwing Molotov cocktails at the Canadian embassy in Port-au-Prince, of speechifying against Canadian imperialism, of doing artwork. This crucifix, you see a guy who's crucified and you have the flag of the U.S., France, and Canada, the three imperial powers in Haiti. Example after example, and this goes back to 2004, where Canada overthrew Haiti's elected government. Canadian special forces were on the ground the night Jean-Bertrand Aristide was forced out of office by U.S. Marines. Canada was involved in planning the coup, going back over a year. That was actually reported on a year before the coup happened, that there was a meeting that Canada organized to plan to oust Aristide's government. And there are just example after example since then where we talk about how we're giving aid to Haiti, and you actually look at what the aid is. The aid is to pay for cops that are and training of cops that are killing peaceful demonstrators right after the coup. The aid is for paying officials of the coup government, literally employees of our aid agency that oversee the imprisonment of the constitutional prime minister, the constitutional interior minister. I'm talking about back in 2006. After the earthquake in 2010, our aid is going to having Canadian troops, 2,000 Canadian troops, occupy the country to deal with what and this is that we have the internal government, Canadian government documents. Their concern was that there may be a popular revolt and that Aristide, the ousted president, might return from South Africa where he was in exile. So this is a Canadian policy that has continued for 2 decades of aligning with the most reactionary sectors of Haitian society, and of course aligning with Washington against the repeatedly stated interests of the impoverished majority of Haiti, and just to go back to the Security Council question, the Jovenel Moïse joined the Lima group of opponents to Venezuela, to the Canadian-led group to oppose the Maduro government in Venezuela, and the only reason Moïse is in office is because he has the support of the U.S. and Canada. And Moïse then pressured the Caribbean countries in the most recent CARICOM meeting to join in on this campaign against Maduro. So you have a policy, an anti-democratic policy in Haiti, anti-sovereignty policy, Canadian anti-sovereignty policy, and a policy of driving Haiti towards Canada's geopolitical efforts to undermine left-wing governments in the hemisphere.
Okay. Tamara, did you want to jump in on Syria, Nicaragua, Haiti, any of those?
Sure. On Syria, I will just say that Canada has been partnering with the United States on a regime change operation in Syria since 2014. So Canada, with the United States, was bombing Syria and Iraq from 2014 to 2016. Then Canada from 2016 until just a few months ago, Canada was doing all of the refueling for U.S.-led airstrikes against Syria and Iraq. Canada doesn't support the Assad government in Syria. Canada has enacted illegal sanctions against the country, along with Venezuela and Nicaragua. And what Canada is doing in Syria defies a really important principle of international law and international relations, and that is respecting sovereignty and self-determination. So Canada is interfering in these countries, trying to topple governments in Syria and in Venezuela and other countries through its interventions and sanctions. And so Canada can't be trusted for a seat on the Security Council. It's not supporting peace and security. It's supporting war and insecurity.
Okay. We've got another 5 minutes. And this question is partly what was asked by Brandon Umferville, who wants to know how Canada's lobbying efforts compare to those of Norway and Ireland. But I would also ask, what do you think the chances are that Canada will obtain its seat, will win its bid?
Well, I think that, I mean, the Canadian government is lobbying very aggressively, has been lobbying on this issue for a couple of years. It's been engaged in this campaign for quite a while now. Now, the media, the general portrayal out there is that Norway is almost for sure going to win one of the two seats, and that it's really a competition between Canada and Ireland. The media portrays Canada in this. Like, even if you look at aid, okay, so Norway gives over 1% of its GDP in overseas development assistance. Canada, as Tamara pointed out, is closer to a quarter. But Canada actually gives as much aid as Norway does, because its economy and its population is so much bigger than Norway, and way more than Ireland. Okay, so Canada is part of the G7. Canada is part the group of seven, seven of the most powerful countries in the world. Canada is part of La Francophonie and the Commonwealth. Canada speaks the two main colonial languages. Canada has a membership position on the IMF and the World Bank. I believe Ireland is actually under Canada, is part of the grouping that Canada has the official seat at the IMF. So Canada is way more powerful country than either Ireland or Norway. Usually in international affairs, power is what determines things. So Canada has, in my opinion, incredible advantages over Ireland and Norway for this Security Council seat. The fact that it's actually a competition, that it's a tight race, and a lot of people think Canada might not win, speaks to the fact that there is a recognition out there in the world, in this very inegalitarian world of the UN, where justice is rarely what determines things, but Canada's the recognition is such that there is a chance that Canada won't win, and these are ultimately the ambassadors get to make the votes if they're secret ballots. And so the hope with the campaign, the general petition open letter that has towards over 2,000, I think around 2,200, 2,300 signatures since it was released 2 weeks ago. So people can sign that at foreignpolicy.ca. It will be sent to all the UN ambassadors about a week before the vote. And the another open letter focused specifically on Palestine, which is being sent. You can, at Just Peace Advocates website, you can send it to all the UN ambassadors. The objectives of these campaigns is that some morality will come into the decision-making of the UN member states ambassadors, that when they're ultimately in that ability to cast that ballot secretly, that they will do what's right. Clearly what's right is to not vote for Canada, to vote for Ireland or Norway. Yes.
Tamara, would you like to have a last word here?
Well, just very quickly, Ireland has a very strong reputation in peacekeeping and in peace-building initiatives. Norway has a very strong international reputation on conflict mediation and resolution. Norway, for instance, was trying to resolve the internal conflict in Venezuela, for instance. And as I mentioned earlier, on a per capita basis and as a percent of gross national income, Norway and Ireland are spending more on overseas development assistance. And I think there's greater trust for those countries. I expect, as well as some other academics in international relations are expecting, that Norway and Ireland are going to win the two seats.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both so much. Before I turn this back over to Nathan, I just want to say that, I started out and I said that this is a teachable moment, and I think, thanks to both of you, Tamara and Yves, we've learned a tremendous amount. You really have cast a very harsh light on Canada's foreign policy, and you've made a very strong case for why we don't deserve a seat in the UN Security Council. I want to thank you both. You've done a tremendous job. And thank you all to the listeners. And I will now give the floor to Nathan, who will wrap up.
Thanks a lot, Andrea, and thank you, Yves and Tamara, for a very insightful talk. Just before we go, I just want to remind everyone that Yves' latest the latest book that Eve has worked on, House of Mirrors, which is the first book on Justin Trudeau's foreign policy, that we're offering it at a special price. The ebook is available for only $5, and the print book is at a discount of 30% off. So you can order that from our website. And just to also highlight 2 other books, Eve mentioned the previous book that of his that we've published, Left Right, March into the Beat of Imperial Canada, which is a critique of the left in Canada and their endorsement of Canadian imperialism. And then finally, I want to direct you all to Martin Lukash's book, which just came out late last year in August, just before the federal elections, The Trudeau Formula: Seduction and Betrayal in an Age of Discontent. No, it's not a soap. It's not a soapy. It's about Canadian. It's about the current Trudeau government and the gap between the marketing talk and the real action that we need on ecology, on social issues, etc. So, and you can get all of those books from our website, and you can get the PDFs of those books at payhip.com/blackrosebooks. The link is in the description. Finally, I just want to thank again our partners, which are Ricochet, Just Peace Advocates, Canadian Dimension, and the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. You can see the other talks that we've done online if you click the Black Rose Books logo just below this video. You can see the other talks we have online, and you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and our newsletter. Thank you very much. And
Nathan,
yep.
Will this talk also be online soon?
This talk, as soon as we end this call, it will be available online for the whole world to watch at this same place. So you can share this link to your friends, family, everyone you want. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye-bye.
See you tomorrow. See you, Eve. See you, Andrew.
Very good. You were very good.